Hello there, and welcome back to the Codex. And welcome back to day 8 out of 31 of doing a video every single day of December to celebrate Tennobomb. Today's topic is me wanting to go over all of the leaks that our Lord and Savior Pablo has released in regards to some of the new Arcanes coming out in the old piece update. Now, we do know that there's at least 9 new quote-unquote Arcanes, and we'll talk about why I say quote-unquote and at least 9 later in the video. I believe they said it was 4 for Warframes, 3 primaries, 1 secondary, and 1 melee. So I wanted to talk about some of them that he already showcased on Twitter. He showed 4 of them. The first one that we saw is Arcane Circumvent, and I'll put this up on the screen for you guys to see and read for yourself as I talk about them. Arcane Circumvent says roll through enemies to steal 50% of their defenses for yourself, and stolen armor lasts for 5 seconds. Now it says steal up to 50% of their defenses, so presumably this means that you're stealing overguard, shields, and armor. I would assume not health, because technically health is not a defense. It's your health. You're like the term defense applies to things that mitigate the damage taken to health. So that again, that should be shields, overguard, and armor. Now, of course, we already know for a fact that it's overguard because in the video that Pablo showcased on his Twitter, he rolled through an enemy and obtained overguard. I think it was 15k, for example. And I think that that's not random either. I'm pretty sure that this Arcane is probably going to have the same 15,000 cap that a lot of overguard effects in the game have, like secondary fortify, for example, and a lot of Warframes. Even though they scale with strength, their base cap of overguard is 15,000 for multiple different overguard generating abilities, like Styanax with his augment. I forget the name of the augment, but you know, Dante, his overguard ability, so on, so on. I believe Frost as well. So a lot of them cap out 15k. I'm willing to bet that this Arcane also caps at 15k, because if it actually let you steal 50% of like a level cap enemy's overguard, for example, then you could get like hundreds of thousands of overguard by rolling through somebody. Not that it's necessarily actually super overpowered like it might sound, because you know, if you actually are at that high of a level, while you might steal 1 million overguard, you're also probably gonna get, you know, 1 million overguard immediately ripped off of you in a single hit, because enemies do so much damage at that level. But we also know, in addition to overguard, that it's going to steal armor, because the end of the Arcane description specifically mentions stolen armor lasts for 5 seconds. I would assume that the reason why armor has that duration on it is, well, for one, of course, it has to have some duration. You can't just let you infinitely stack armor. That would actually make armor overpowered, unlike it is now. But I'm assuming, or hoping at least rather, that you can roll through multiple enemies and stack for that duration of 5 seconds, unlimited amount of armor. So if you, because enemies have an armor cap, so if this resets on every roll, for example, then that means that the max amount of armor that we can mathematically steal from an enemy would be half of 2700, because 2700 is the armor cap in the game, so half of that would be 1350. So if it resets on every roll, that means that our capped armor bonus is 1350 from this. But if it allows you to instead steal up to half of an enemy's armor for any amount of enemies that they roll through within 5 seconds, if you roll through like 6 dudes and they're all high enough level to where they have the armor cap, then all of a sudden now you just, you know, grab like what, 4, 5, 6, 7,000 armor potentially. Now it is only for a few seconds, but if you're in an environment or a game mode that has consistently high enemy count, you could actually use that to pretty heavily juice your EHP fairly consistently. And then of course stealing shields, that's also an interesting concept, because that means you could potentially do a shield gating build where you restore your shield gate by rolling through an enemy, rather than our current meta of using just the, you know, the brief respite and the augur mods being essentially the only way to generate shields outside of frame specific abilities that specifically give you shields back. Now, another one of the Arcanes that he showed off, moving on from that, is Primary Bulwark, which says, and this is all these descriptions are for rank 5, obviously, by the way. Gain plus 1% damage for each unit of armor past 1,000, up to a max of plus 500%. Now, what that means is, if you're having trouble parsing that, it means that basically once you have 1,500 armor or higher, because the Arcane doesn't start stacking until 1,001 armor, basically, every point of armor past 1,000 will give you 1 point of extra damage. So that means that at 1,500 armor, you cap out the Arcane at giving you 500% damage bonus. Now, presumably, given the fact that the number is so high, I'm assuming that this is additive damage. Technically, we don't know for a fact if this is a multiplicative effect, as in it multiplies off of base damage, or if it is base damage. Although I'm 99% certain that's base damage, because if this worked as a multiplier, that would mean that this Arcane would multiply your primary's weapon damage by 6x on any frame that's able to cap the Arcane out. So that would be, of course, basically insane, and making an Arcane that's equivalently as powerful as a Mirage Eclipse in essence. So I'm almost certain it's going to be a Serration style additive mod bonus. But even then, that doesn't make it bad. It makes it very good on frames that have high enough armor to actually make this arcane give more base damage than a normal base damage arcane like Merciless or Deadhead or something like that, for example. And it also has the advantage of being conditional based off of the amount of armor you have rather than being conditional on getting kills. So another benefit of this arcane would be the fact that even if you weren't actively shooting your gun, like say you're meleeing for 10 minutes straight and then you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to pull up my primary now. Your primary will already immediately have that full 500% damage bonus if you have enough armor to trigger it. Since, you know, it's not based off kills, that means that you're not going to have to deal with that slow startup time of having to build up a base damage on the first few guys that die really slowly due to not currently having any. Now, you'll still have to get kills to stack up your galvanized mods and whatnot, for example, but having that large chunk of base damage up front is just going to make that much simpler to do when you get into higher level content where the enemies are a bit spongier if you don't already have some base damage active, and it makes, again, you know, arcanes like Merciless and whatnot annoying to use. Now, you would think that Chroma, for example, would be one of the best frames for this, but unfortunately, since this is most likely base damage, even though Chroma would be one of the frames that could easily cap out the armor bonus to actually activate this arcane, he's also one of the frames that would least benefit from it, because his Vex armor, especially with very high power swing values, already gives him so much base damage that you would experience fairly severe diminishing returns and or opportunity cost to use this arcane for relatively not that large of a damage increase on a frame that already has, again, so much base damage. However, though, the frame that you currently see me playing as in this background gameplay here, Valkyrie, she would actually benefit from it if you ever do actually use your primary as Valkyrie, not me. I basically only use my claws. But if you're ever in a situation where you're like, oh, I like to use my primary to, you know, quickly one-tap an Acolyte or an Eximus or something, then it's nice for her because, of course, with her having 1,000 starting armor in the first place, and then Warcry easily multiplying you far past 1,500, she will max out this arcane, which means that you could have a primary Bulwark, you know, primary on your Valkyrie to be able to whip out a already juiced up weapon on command. So there's ways to find it useful and to, you know, get some utility out of it. But moving on to the next one, we also got Arcane Persistence. This one is by far the most interesting looking one to me, because this might actually change the meta when it comes to health tanking. It says remove all shields, so you have no shields, and then it says if armor is above 700, cannot be hit for more than 500 damage. Now, from the wording, you would assume that this means 500 damage per instance of incoming damage. So if you get hit with 10 projectiles, each of those 10 projectiles can only deal a max of 500 damage. However, on Twitter, Pablo specified that this is actually a max of 500 damage per second. Now, I'm really hoping, now that's, just to clarify, that's even stronger than per instance, because if you take, you know, 10 shots from all the enemies around you per second, for example, and each of those is able to deal a max of 500 damage, then you could still take 5,000 damage that second because you took 10 of those 500 cap shots. But if it's 500 damage per second, then you can take 1,000 hits in 1 second that each do 1,000,000 damage, but you're only taking 500 damage. Now, there's a few things that are going to dictate whether or not this is actually insanely busted useful and actually makes health taking so good that you can basically level cap with health taking now, or more towards this not being so great. And one of those factors is Pablo being basically grammatically accurate? It is the way that this arcane works, that the max amount of damage you can take per second is 500, or can it only block up to 500 damage per second? Because those are two very different statements. Now, I'm hoping that it's what he basically said it was, and that you can only take 500 damage per second, but if this could only block up to 500 damage per second, and that's basically not going to do anything in very high-level environments where 500 damage is a small fraction of their total damage output. You'll still just get one tapped. But if this limits you to taking 500 damage per second, that could be absolutely busted for health tanking, because then another question you have to ask is this pre or post mitigation? So what that means is it a max of 500 damage after mitigations, or is that you can only take a cap of 500 damage and then it's affected by mitigations? Because if it's the latter, then you could take almost 0 damage. There's multiple frames, like Chroma, for example, especially in Fisher missions with, you know, heavy armor stacking from Vex armor and you know, being Nidus buffed and Oberon. There's a bunch of ways you can get a crazy amount of armor and actual damage reduction effects, like, for example, the Guardian armor augment for Chroma, that allow you to hit 99% plus DR, and very easily 95% plus. But especially in, like, the 99% scenario, that would mean that you could reduce that 500 damage taken max down to 5. That would literally make you be so tanky that you could health tank at level cap. Like, you could actually do level 10,000 content health tanking with this arcane. So we'll have to see how that turns out. Again, it's going to completely depend on the specific math of how that actually works out. And the last example here is not technically an arcane in the usual sense. It's what's called a Tektolyst Artifact, which this is presumably going to be the style of quote-unquote arcanes that we slot into the Tauron ultimate ability. Basically, for those of you that didn't see it, we're getting a new modding screen for our new operator weapon, basically, / ultimate ability. And these ultimate abilities for each of the 5 trees is going to have a modding screen where you can put 5, I believe it was 5 mods, and then 1 arcane looking slot in the middle. Now, presumably these Tektolyst artifacts are arcanes for the ultimate, so that's what they're called, is Tektolyst artifacts. Basically this new / technically old sentient technology. And what this one says it does is gain invisibility for 30 seconds after activating a Tauron strike, and plus 12% Tauron strike charge rate. So you get to use that ultimate more often, and you get invisibility for half a minute upon using it. So it makes you think about, what are the other artifacts going to be like? What if there's one that's like, you know, oh, after using your Tauron strike, your next 3 ability casts have 75% extra strength. Like, who knows what other kinds of interesting buffs and operator synergy we're going to receive. I mean, I love, one of my favorite things to do in Warframe is to combine different aspects of my loadout together to buff my, you know, one cohesive kit. So it'd be really cool if we have more operator tech that allows us to buff our frames or buff our weapons, for example, or like snapshot more strength onto abilities. You know, I love snapshotting. For those of you that know me on stream, you see me do that all the time in Fisher missions and whatnot. But yeah, that's it. That's what we've seen so far. I just wanted to show a quick rundown of those very interesting arcanes that they showed up so far. And I do wonder if it's actually only 9, because I'm pretty sure that from the fact that they said, I believe, 4 frame arcanes, 3 primaries, 1 secondary, 1 melee, but then we see this Tektolyst one. I'm pretty sure it's going to be 9 arcanes plus a bunch of these Tektolyst artifacts. So it's actually going to be a lot more than 9 quote-unquote arcanes, in addition to all of these brand new mods that we're also going to be modding the Tauron strikes with. So again, there's a ton of content coming. I'm super excited. Obviously, when it actually comes out, I'm going to be heavily going over it all. I'm going to be dropping that video for you guys. We'll talk about what everything does, what's the best to use, you know, what kind of crazy math can we whip up here. It's going to be a fun time. Hopefully this was a useful video for you guys. I found it very interesting what Pablo posted on Twitter. Hopefully you guys did too. If he shows off any more, then I might also talk about that. But for the meantime, hopefully you enjoyed video number 8 of the month, and come back for tomorrow's video, number 9.